In 1945, 5 Navy bombers lifted off from a Florida airfield on a routine training flight and were never seen again. It became the founding mystery of the Bermuda Triangle, proof that something in these waters defies explanation. At least, that's the version that sold the books and filled the documentaries. The real flight records, the radio transcripts, the weather reports from that afternoon tell a different story. And once you read them, the legend doesn't get more mysterious. It quietly falls apart, and what's left is stranger still. So what actually happened over the Atlantic on the afternoon of December 5th, 1945? 5 torpedo bombers left the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale on a training run out over the Bahamas. The sky started clear and turned against them. Somewhere over open water, the flight leader became convinced his compass had failed and that he was looking down at the Florida Keys, when he was almost certainly northeast of the islands, steering the whole formation in the wrong direction. As the fuel gauges dropped, those planes were flying away from land, into the dark, into a rising sea. Heavy aircraft like that break apart when they hit the water, and they sink fast. And the ocean that night was cold enough that survival would have been measured in hours, not days. Then came the second loss. A rescue plane went up to find them, a PBM Mariner carrying 13 men, and it vanished too. That aircraft was so flammable that the crews who flew it called it the flying gas tank, and a ship in the area that evening reported seeing a burst of flame on the water near its flight path. The version you've heard tells you the triangle reached up and erased them. The records describe 2 terrible, ordinary accidents on one bad night. And Flight 19 wasn't even the strangest loss the legend would claim. For that, you have to go back another 27 years, to the single biggest disappearance in the whole story. In March of 1918, a United States Navy ship called the Cyclops vanished on a voyage from Barbados to Baltimore. She was a collier, more than 500 feet long, with over 300 people aboard, and she went down without a single distress call and without leaving a trace anyone could find. To this day, she remains one of the largest losses of life in American naval history that had nothing to do with combat. Now, if you only ever hear that much, it sounds genuinely impossible. How does a ship that size simply cease to exist? But the writers who made her a triangle legend always seem to stop the story right there, because the rest of it isn't mysterious at all. The Cyclops was carrying close to 11,000 tons of dense manganese ore, and she was loaded well past the weight she could safely handle. Before she ever left South America, her own captain had reported that one of her engines had a cracked cylinder and was no longer working. The board that reviewed that report sent her home anyway. So picture it, an aging, overloaded ship, riding low and heavy in the water, running on a crippled engine, crossing a stretch of ocean famous for storms that rise without warning. The Navy's own historians concluded she most likely sank in weather she simply could not survive. For years, people preferred a more dramatic answer, that a German submarine had sunk her in the final months of the First World War, but the German Navy's own records showed they had never so much as encountered the ship. There has never been anything strange about what happens to an overloaded ship with a broken engine in a storm. The only mystery is the one the writers needed her to be. That's where these stories should have ended. They didn't, because the Bermuda Triangle was never built by investigators. It was built by writers. In 1950, an Associated Press reporter named Edward Van Winkle Jones gathered a handful of unrelated losses into a single article. 2 years later, a magazine called Fate drew the first version of the triangle on a map. Then, in 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published a piece titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, and that name stuck to the public imagination like tar. Charles Berlitz turned it into a book in 1974 that sold more than 5 million copies and became a movie. Each new author did the same thing the last one had done. They added cases, they left out the storms, and they quietly moved the borders of the triangle outward to swallow whatever new incident they wanted to include. Watch how the trick works up close. When Gaddis wrote that founding article in 1964, the very first ship he listed was a tanker called the Marine Sulphur Queen, which had disappeared off the Florida coast a year earlier. He wrote that she had sailed into the unknown. What he chose not to mention was that the Coast Guard had already documented her as a badly maintained, unseaworthy vessel that arguably should never have been allowed to leave port. The inconvenient half of the story simply vanished from the page. And some of the cases didn't even happen in the right ocean. The Mary Celeste, the most famous ghost ship in all of maritime history, gets dragged into the triangle constantly, even though she was found drifting and abandoned off the coast of Portugal, far out in the eastern Atlantic, closer to Europe than to Bermuda. The shape on the map was never fixed. It grew or shrank to fit the story being told, which is the detail almost everyone missed. By 1972, the legend had a problem, and his name was Larry Kusch. He was a reference librarian in Arizona, and he kept getting the same question across his desk so often that he decided to do something no triangle author had bothered with. He checked. He went case by case, writing to the Coast Guard, to the Air Force, to the insurers at Lloyd's of London, and pulling microfilm of the original newspapers from the exact days each ship or plane was lost. What he found took the mystery apart in his hands. Storms that the books never mentioned had been raging during many of the disappearances. Some incidents had happened nowhere near the triangle at all, hundreds of miles outside any version of its borders. Some ships described as vanished had actually been found, or had simply arrived in port late. And a few of the most famous cases had no record of ever happening in the first place. People believed they had the full picture. They were wrong. You would think someone would have checked the original reports before printing the legend 100 times over. For years, nobody did. In 1975, Couchet published his findings under a blunt title, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved. And his conclusion was simple. This was a manufactured mystery, assembled out of sloppy research and good storytelling. If the writers had stopped to read the records, there would have been no legend to sell. If a mystery falling apart under a stack of old newspapers is the kind of story you enjoy, subscribe, because this channel takes one science mystery apart every week. Now let's go back to the water itself, because the legend made one promise the records could never keep. Pull back from any single case and look at the whole region, and the official verdict is almost boring. The Coast Guard, in its own public answer to this exact question, says a review of the losses in the area turned up nothing beyond physical causes. No Navy, no aviation authority, no maritime body marks this stretch of ocean as special on any chart. The underwriters at Lloyd's of London, the people who make their living pricing risk to the decimal, charge no more to ensure a crossing here than anywhere else on the open Atlantic, and they put numbers behind it. In 1975, Lloyd's reported that hundreds of vessels had been logged as missing across the entire world's oceans over the previous 2 decades, and that they could find no evidence the Bermuda Triangle lost ships at a higher rate than anywhere else. The Coast Guard, working from its own casualty records, said precisely the same thing. And today, thousands of ships and aircraft cross this region every single day without incident. Steered by satellite navigation, the lost crews of the past could only have dreamed of. And here's the piece that explains the whole illusion. This region sits across some of the busiest shipping lanes and flight corridors on the planet. The water between Florida, the Caribbean, and the wider Atlantic. When you run that much traffic through one area, you get a large raw number of accidents, while the rate stays completely ordinary. Think about that for a second. The triangle looks deadly because it's crowded, not because it's cursed. Our minds do the rest. We're wired to link rare, dramatic events together. So once a place earns a frightening name, every loss inside it gets filed under the legend. And every identical loss somewhere else gets filed under bad weather and forgotten. And if you went hunting for danger somewhere else with the same appetite, you would find it everywhere you looked. The cold, storm-hammered North Sea, the enormous emptiness of the Pacific, the brutal Southern Ocean at the bottom of the world, all of them claim far more ships than this warm Atlantic crossing ever has. Judge those waters the way we judge the triangle, and the whole map would be covered in deadly triangles. We just never bothered to give them a frightening name. The Gulf Stream finishes the trick. It runs fast and warm straight through these waters, and it would carry wreckage far from wherever a ship actually went down, which is exactly where the phrase, "not a trace," came from. This was never really about a triangle. It was about the ocean, and the ocean turns out to be far stranger than the legend ever gave it credit for. Take rogue waves. For centuries, sailors swore that walls of water could rise out of a calm sea and crush a ship without warning. And for centuries, scientists filed those accounts under superstition. Then, on January 1st, 1995, an instrument on a North Sea platform measured one as it passed, a single wave towering far above the seas around it, appearing from nothing. They are real, and they happen across every ocean on Earth. Then, there is the methane theory you may have heard. A laboratory study in 2003 showed that a large enough bubble of gas rising from the seafloor really could sink a model ship by stealing its buoyancy, which is a genuinely unsettling idea. The problem is that there is no evidence it ever happened to a real vessel here, and the seafloor in this region has not produced a release like that in roughly 15,000 years. And in 2016, headlines around the world announced the triangle had finally been solved by strange hexagonal clouds that fired down air bombs of wind. Then, the scientists quoted in those stories came forward and said their words had been twisted, that they had claimed nothing of the kind. The myth was being manufactured all over again, live, in real time, in front of everyone. Even the spinning compass has an answer, and it is older than the legend itself. When Christopher Columbus crossed these same waters in 1492, he wrote in his log about a strange light on the horizon, and a compass that no longer pointed where it should. 5 centuries later, his needle has a name. There is a real line on the globe where a compass points toward true north instead of magnetic north, and crossing it has confused navigators since the age of sail. None of it is supernatural. All of it is real. That is the part that lands stranger than any conspiracy. There was never a monster waiting in the water. There was an ordinary, dangerous, genuinely beautiful ocean, and a story we simply could not stop telling about it. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Cushy took this mystery apart almost 50 years ago, case by case, in print, with the records to back every page. He spent the rest of his life as a careful skeptic, and he died in 2024. Yet the legend he dismantled is arguably more alive now than it was when he started. It spreads across the internet faster than any correction ever could, in videos and posts and breathless headlines. Almost every one of them recycling the same small handful of cases he already explained. That's the real anomaly in these waters. And it isn't the ships at all. It's the story itself. A good mystery, it turns out, is far harder to sink than any ship ever was. Go back one last time to those 5 bombers, lifting off from Fort Lauderdale on a clear December afternoon. For the better part of a century, they've stood for everything we can't explain about the sea. The records tell something quieter and sadder. The records describe young pilots, a failing compass, a turn in the wrong direction, and a night that turned dark and cold too fast for any of them to make it home. There was no portal and no hidden force, only the Atlantic, doing what the Atlantic has always done, and people who needed the loss to mean something larger than weather. The water out there looks the same today as it did then. Open horizon in every direction. The Gulf Stream's sliding north under a flat gray sky. Container ships and airliners crossing it by the thousand without a second thought. Somewhere far below, the wrecks that started all of this rest exactly where physics left them, on an ordinary patch of an ordinary, enormous ocean. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to continue watching more of my videos on science mysteries, you can click the video on the screen now.